Diane, all right, see you afterwards.
Once again, open side.
I really wish he wasn't so cute. So next week is the state convention for Virginia Baptists. I know I'm going to some. I know some of you will be there. But with that upcoming and some of the conversations that we've been having about missions and that sort of thing, it reminded me of a talk I heard at a BGAV convention several years ago. There was a speaker there named Alan Hirsch. And he's not a Baptist, but a very influential and well-known speaker on missions. And so us Baptists brought in this world-renowned guy to help us understand what was going on. And so he was basically saying that Baptists needed to rethink the idea of missions. He was pointing out, and these are things we all know, but it's the people that write them down in books that get famous, He said, the thing is, it used to be that everybody kind of got church. Culturally, we were more Christian. Everybody either went to church or kind of knew church people, but everybody knew the lingo, everybody knew the music, and it was, and in many communities, the church was kind of the center of the social network. And it was easier then. You built a nice church and people would just show up. And that's not really true anymore. Now, most of the people around us don't really understand the language we use within the church. They don't know the music. I mean, where else do you hear organ music? Hockey rink, maybe? That doesn't count. Just happens to be an organ that they play da-da-da-da-da-da with. Now, most people who don't do church don't really understand church. It's not, and it's different. And so, in a lot of cases, we end up thinking back to the good old days when people just came to church, and it was so much easier. You build a good church, they come, and it's familiar, and everybody gets it, and you don't have to work through those things. But now there's a culture gap. There's a distance between church people and people who don't go to church, and it's hard to bridge sometimes, and the frustrating thing is the people least familiar with church are the ones at the top of our list. Those are the ones we are most called to find and connect to, right? Okay, I'm not seeing a lot of nods, so I'm like, wait a minute. Those are the people we want to connect to. Those are the ones Jesus said, go and find them. But Dr. Hirsch was pointing out that we've kind of flipped things around. And historically, as the church, as missionaries for Christ, the believers would do the crossing of the gap. They would say, well, we'll come to you and we'll learn your language and your customs and your ways, and then try to share with you, right? I mean, does that sound like what missionaries do? And he said, the thing is, now, in the modern church, at least in Baptist circles, but this is true of the churches that I have known of, now we're saying, hey, you lost people, come to us. Come learn our language and the things that we do and our customs. Do you see how that's flipped around? In a sense, and nobody could argue with him, he's saying, we're asking them to be missionaries to us. Yeah, we could stop there and really chew on that for days, couldn't we? I mean, that was a heavy hit for a room full of pastors and church leaders. So he was saying, asking them to find us is not quite how the Great Commission reads. Now, here's another thing. People, when we think about someone coming to Christ and joining the church, what they've found by studying these folks is that in about 18 months, this is really amazing. I grew up in church, so this is harder for me to connect to. But in about 18 months, someone who accepts Christ and becomes an active part of the church has disconnected from all of their previous social circles. Does that sound about right? Because, once we get a hold of you, we're part of the family, and we suck you in. That's not bad. But why do we disconnect from the old social circles? Have you ever thought about that? Why, and some of it goes back to the, hanging around Christians instead of around, sinners or whatever. But when someone has connections outside of the church, we should be thinking, hey, awesome. That's a great inroads to connecting to those people. But instead, we're like, stay with us. You see? And again, we're just talking about church, capital C. This is just kind of how we tend to do things. Because we should always be looking for missionary opportunities, right? And finding someone who has connections outside of the church, that should be, the green light for us to try to reach that group. But instead, we tend to just kind of, get everyone inside and hunker down and wait for the lost people to find us. Now, how would you feel if the BGAV or the cooperative program or any organization, a missions organization that we support and pray for and send money to, if they sent us their annual report and they said, you know what, we're dropping the whole idea of sending people to places. We're just sending invitations all over the world. And when they're ready, they're going to come and find us. Yeah, we would drop our funding in a heartbeat, wouldn't we? Because we believe that missions is going to find people. And yet, how is it, and I'm including myself in this, I'm not pointing any fingers, how is it that we end up thinking that only the missionaries should be doing that? We're like, well, we've got missionaries going to reach lost people. We're going to stay here and hang out. Why do we do that? Is it just more comfortable, or are we letting ourselves off the hook? Jesus didn't say, some of you go ye therefore into the world, and the rest of you, you're fine. I don't think it went that way. How did we get to where we think some can be missionaries and the rest don't have to worry about it? That's a problem. And so, again, you can just picture, I elaborated some of my own thoughts, but that was the gist of Dr. Hirsch's speech. And so it was really quiet in that auditorium, all of these people thinking, how is it that we've let the mission of the church become a program that some of us do sometimes? It was very unsettling. And I thought of that because Micah was one of many, but he was a prophet that was willing to give some unsettling news to the people of Israel. He was very frustrated, and you can tell it in the things that are in this book. He was frustrated with these people, the way they did religion, the way that they pridefully refused to acknowledge that anything was off. And as we've looked at different books in the minor prophets, we've seen this constant theme of denial. And we've over and over just said, we can't be like that. We can't just say, oh, but we're fine. We're going to take hard looks at this stuff and see what it means for us, and not stick our fingers in our ears and hope that the problem passes us by. We're focusing on chapter 6, but you've got to go back and read this later. Make a little note. Micah chapter 2. He's railing about the way things are going in this country. Yes, I could have done the whole sermon just on this chapter. But he's like, you got all these false prophets that don't want anything negative ever to come up. Sound like news to you? It's like it's depending on which side you're on or who your person is. Oh, let's pretend that didn't happen. Let's talk about something else. And he actually says, you know what you would love? You'd love a prophet that said your future held lots of beer and wine. Yeah, he was mad. He was probably right. But I just had to throw that in there because it's awesome. And you may know that tucked into Micah chapter 5 is the promise of the ruler from Bethlehem, one of those Jesus references that it's easy to miss. But we're going to focus in on chapter 6 today. which is probably the best known chapter. But I'm going to read a little piece of it, and then we'll kind of talk through. It's really interesting. My NIV says that at the top of this section, the Lord's case against Israel. The whole thing sounds like a courtroom drama. If you look at the way that it's set up, there's pleading cases and witnesses and this sort of thing. So just listen to this. This is the start of chapter 6. Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth, for the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's been one of my favorites for a long, long time. But today I hope we can get a better context for what's going on in this. And so here, God invites Israel to, he's like, go ahead, plead your case, because I have plenty of charges to bring against you. But yeah, here's the mountains and the hills. They're listening, and the people seem to feel like God was being unfair to them. God, why are you getting on our case? Those other nations are way wickeder than we are. We're the good ones. We're your people. How come you're all mad? And they're prospering. They're bad people, and they're doing great. Why are we struggling? Not fair. Well, God begins to recite his thoughts on things. And this isn't obvious to us, but this follows the format of ancient treaties where there would be the reciting of different things. In general, the king, who would be asking, for the subjection of the people, would recite all of the things he had done, all of the benefits that they had gained from serving him, and then say, here's what will happen if you serve me faithfully, and here's what will happen if you break the contract. And then the people could declare their allegiance or not. The problem with this was that Israel had already broken their covenant with God, so they don't have much of a leg to stand on in reality. And so you can hear some frustration in God's speech here. What have I done to you? Really, how have I burdened you? This sounds a little bit like a parent talking to their child, doesn't it? Well, tell me all the things I've done to make your life so terrible. What did I do to deserve this kind of anger and rejection? And so here's God saying, yes, I saved you from slavery. I kept you from being cursed and guided you and made sure that you had blessings. I provided leaders. I led you across the Jordan. I was the one behind your numerous, improbable military victories. Was that so bad for me to do? And he says, remember your journey. If you looked back on where you had been and where you are now, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If you just remembered what I've done, where I brought you from, how I got you here, we wouldn't be having this problem. You would remember the righteousness of God, the justice of God. You would have unwavering commitment to God if you really kept fresh in your mind the journey The hills and the mountains remember all this, but apparently the people had forgotten. Remember. And that's a powerful word in English, but the Hebrew word is an even stronger one, if that's possible. It's the word zakar. And it wasn't just having the memory in your head. This was a word that referred to passing on the ancient stories of faith. This was about teaching important lessons and not just memorizing it, but identifying fully with what happened, recognizing that the things, for us, the stories aren't just stories, but part of our journey, and identifying with what has happened in the past, realizing it's not just in the past, but part of our ongoing life. So he's saying, Zakar, if you really connected yourself to all that God had done. You remember when God visited Gideon. Gideon's like, oh, I've read all the stories. I know what God used to do. Instead of, that's our God. We know what he can do. We know he's brought us. He didn't zakar. He didn't connect the past to the present and see that the same God was at work in Israel right then. We can't let the things that God does become a distant memory. We can't get into the what have you done for me lately kind of thing. Because God has done amazing things for us over and over. And when we let that be distant instead of fresh and powerful, we've failed to zakar. We've failed to keep that in our memory the way that we're supposed to. I mean, we all know the stories of Jesus. Our Sunday school teachers work hard to get these into the minds of our children. We do this. Bible school, everything is built to get these stories into the heads of our kids. But we don't want them to just say, gee, wasn't Jesus great? That's not the goal. We want them to internalize this and see that it matters for their lives now, right? Okay, I was really hoping you would be with me on that one. That's what we're doing here. These are the stories that help us see that we're part of the same story, that it's all the same thing, that we're living out what began there. We want our kids to feel a part of the kingdom of God that runs through all these stories. That's what we're aiming for. We want everyone to realize this is our mission. This is the story of God reaching humanity, and we're part of it now. We want to identify with them, put ourselves in them. And I feel like we work hard on that every week. Not just saying, oh, what an interesting story, but where are we in this? How does this impact us? How do we respond? Well, I think we really work on that. But if we're serious about following Jesus, if we really look at what he did, what he said, then we can't ever let the mission be a side thing, right? If we really kept that at the heart of things, it would never become a side program. Because being Christ-like isn't just being kind and loving and forgiving and all of those other things. It means pursuing the mission that Jesus was here for. And so, here's the thing. We have this mission from Jesus, embodied by Jesus. He gave us our example of how to live for the mission. And then, he established the church to carry that on. And so that mission should be at the heart of every church and everything every church does. But instead, and again, I wasn't there for all this time, but somehow missions became just a program. And again, we work hard at this. This is church in general. How is missions something separate from why churches exist? How is it that we think missions is something that you can choose? You can do this or that. You can be involved, and it should be. It should be something that the church is built around. And what really happened was, instead of saying, okay, here's what we exist for, let's build an organization that makes this happen, what we did was say, well, how do we like things to be let's build a church and then see where we can fit the mission. Is that overly harsh? I think it's kind of accurate. And again, not us, Urbanna, us, the church, at least in America. And so that's why we've drifted away from being missionary-minded and settled for letting people come to us. That's how that's happened in the American church. So, moving on. So, when you're looking at chapter 6, God kind of registers his complaints. And then in verse 6, you get this, this is a response. And some people read this and say, oh, clearly Israel was realizing their mistakes. This sounds penitent. I disagree. I think there's some acknowledgement of sin and transgression, but this doesn't sound penitent. Let me give you my paraphrase of this. So this is a little more like what I think Israel is saying there in verse 6. God, you're acting like we have abandoned you. May we remind you that we have done all of the festivals exactly on time. We've even added some rituals that you didn't say to do. We celebrate every single thing that you ordained and some that you didn't. We acknowledge you routinely, right along with our other gods. Really, what are you looking for here? Do you want more offerings? Is that what you're looking for? Instead of 1 ram, how about 1,000? Instead of 1 thing of oil, how about 1,000,000? Do you want us to bring our kids and sacrifice them on the altar? Is that what you're looking for? You see, that's what's going on here. 10,000 rivers of oil, will that be enough for you, God? So, and again, you may recall, the whole story with Abraham and Isaac, where God asked Abraham to sacrifice his firstborn, although he spared him. Human sacrifice was just a horrifying thing that other cultures did practice that Israel just thought was terrible. And so here they're taking this sacrificial system and they were exaggerating it to ridiculous levels. And most of us have used an argument of this form with someone who is being unreasonable. What is it that you want? Do you want me to follow you around every step of every day and clean up after you? What do you want from me? Blood? Have you ever said that to somebody? Do you want me to be completely focused on you 24/7? Is that what you're looking for? You see, we tend to, we use this kind of exaggerated request sometimes when we feel like people are just asking for too much. And they believed, we've seen this over and over in book after book, they believed if they did all the rituals, everything would be fine. And they're angry because they thought they were doing exactly what God asked them to do. Well, that's partly because they focused on the parts that were comfortable to do and ignored the parts that they didn't really want to deal with, which may be our problem as well. We're already doing all the right things. How much more do you want? And again, they had over and over, we'll just do the same thing, but keep working harder at it, and it'll be fine. And then God responds to this. And one of the things he says that is perhaps the most striking thing in this whole passage, first he says, and this is Micah speaking for God, he has showed you. He already showed you. Why are we even having this conversation? I missed this because, again, I've loved this since I was a teenager, but I missed what was going on. But here's God, again, the gentle father trying to reprimand his children who are so rebellious and so misguided. And he's saying, you're mad at me because you think I'm being unfair. You're mad when you've been doing the wrong thing thinking it was right. I showed you what I wanted. Go back through your stories and you'll see it over and over from the very beginning. I've showed you exactly what you have to do. I'm not being unreasonable. I'm not springing something on you. You know the story of Moses. You know what he taught. It's all there. And honestly, again, thinking back to us, I wonder if they really did know. My suspicion is that they became fixated on the ceremonies because they knew what would happen if they really dealt with the mission that God was trying to get them to embrace. I suspect that. It was just so much easier to do the behaviors, to go through the motions, than it was to really think, what if I give myself wholeheartedly to the mission of God? And again, the American church, same thing. If they or we take God's commands really seriously, comfort is what we lose. It goes right out the window. And again, we, the church, have not kept up with the shifts in culture. That gap has widened and widened, and church after church has said, well, we've got to find a way to connect with the people who are distant from the church. You should have seen all the folks after Dr. Hirsch gave that great speech. They're all like, preach it, brother, amen. And I guarantee you, they went back to their churches and either just said, we're not going to bring this up at the deacons meeting. Or they started having conversations and people realized how much they'd have to give up and it was over. I know that's what happened. I know. And he said, again, to this whole room full of lay leaders and ministers, he said, your churches here in Virginia are perfectly built for what they're doing now. Perfectly designed for what you're accomplishing, which is you're getting older and dying. Perfectly designed for that. So you want that to happen? Keep doing the same thing. And everybody said, we've got to do something. But then they started thinking about what they would have to give up to connect to the next generation. And they said, that's just too much. Let's stick to what we like. That was a little uncomfortable to share, but I felt like it was true. We know, and I feel like we're ahead of the curve on this, honestly. I think we know here at Urbanna that we have to make adjustments to how church works if we're going to connect with people who are in the younger generation. They don't think like us. They don't see things the same way. They're not loyal to institutions just because their parents say this is what we do. It's different. And if we say, well, what we like and how we do it is the most important thing, then we'll die. We, the church, every church. And I've seen some go down with the ship. We know that. And we know what God requires of us. We know He showed us. They only had the benefit of the first part of the Old Testament. We've got the whole story. And we know what God requires of us. And still we struggle with it so much because it's so much easier to do ritual and stick to checking boxes. And so just real quickly, I know we're coming up on 12. Just want to review this last part because it's really important. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. And again, this is where translation kind of gets us because the Hebrew is very different from the English words. These are very dynamic action words in Hebrew. They're kind of more like feelings in a lot of cases in the English language. He doesn't want us to think about justice. He doesn't want us to sit in our prayer groups and say, boy, justice would be nice. He wants us to be about justice. That's what this says. To not act just doesn't capture it. Actively seek justice. Love, the Hebrew word. It's not just a feeling, a warm feeling in your heart. Active pursuit, a powerful, motivating desire to connect with people. It gets to the heart of what a relationship is. It can be translated mercy, kindness, goodness, loyalty, faithfulness, the keys to an honest, clean connection with another person. That's what he wants us to strive for, to really love and walk humbly. Humble is a great word. The better word might even be walk carefully, walk circumspectly, thoughtfully with your God. We should be humble. There's no doubt about that. But thinking carefully about our walk with God, thinking carefully about where he is and where we are, what he wants from us and where we are on that path, that is important. And walking with God, staying with God, journeying with God. He wants us to really work at that, to let him be our guide throughout. And so, the people basically, they're saying, God, what do you want from us? And God, through Micah, was saying, not doing the right things, being about the right things, being driven by love, by justice, taking every step, thinking carefully about where God is going and whether or not you are going with him. That's what God wants from you. So his words for us today, zakar, mishpat, hesed, halak. They're action words. Not thinking in church and sitting in church and thinking good thoughts. Action words. Remembering what God has done and seeing that we're part of that story. Championing justice. Seeking right relationships. Not just with our friends, with each other, with everyone. And walking thoughtfully with God. If you went into a restaurant and ordered a steak, and they brought you a beautiful, steaming bowl of grits. Now, I like grits. You'd be a little disappointed. And if you said, I'm sorry, but I asked for a steak and I got grits, and they brought you a bigger bowl of grits, how would it go down? You following me here? We need to come to terms with what God has asked of us. If I tell Brett to clean his room and he says, I wiped down the sink, Dad. No. I told you to clean your room. I went and walked the dog, Dad. That's not going to make me a happy parent. I want you to do what I told you to do. You with me here? So let's make sure we give God what he wants and not what we want to give him. Let's close with our hymn of commitment today. I love to tell the story. We are here to tell that story. Let's stand up and sing together. Well, we know what to do. Let's make sure we do it. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.